section is really for an open discussion, and as the day has turned into a very intimate discussion, we'll keep it together. Certainly want to give the audience an opportunity to ask the panelists questions, and also want to give the panelists an opportunity to foster discussion between the group as a whole. I just want to throw out three questions that people can answer or think about as they wish or not that came up for me when we were talking, and I'm just going to give them all out there and then come up with a plan. But so, you know, Dennis talked about the APA having sent out this call for comments on the new whatever it is, you know what I'm talking about. And one of the things that intimidated me about giving feedback to this language after reading the Hoffman report was understanding that you know, Beneke, being a lawyer, was really talented at the nuance of language and like Dr. Chin pointed out, that effective at the end of the 4 points of how things should go. And I really felt sort of under-educated as a person and a consumer of APA policy to be able to give feedback in a way that was going to really represent what my viewpoints are. Like, I don't know when I'm reading this language what I'm endorsing and what I'm not, now that I've read the Hoffman report and hear that. So that's kind of a question to the panel and to the group as a whole, like, what are some pieces of language that I need to understand more what those words mean before I can make an informed comment on the APA's proposal. The other thing that came up that Dennis brought up that was also in the report that I thought was interesting to discuss is, as psychologists, who is our client? That was a big debate. Like, is it the public? Is it our patient? Is it the detainee? And I think a lot of times in this discussion that the Hoffman report was investigating is that the government was our client. The DOD, who had hired the psychologist, was our client. So we were doing no harm to the government, but what was happening to the people that were being interrogated? Or you know, the other thing that hasn't really come up is how is the mental health of the people that are participating in the interrogations? What is happening to the psyche of, you know, the 3 men that were brought up under the ethics, and that leads into my next question, which this is, I think, I don't know if I'll be able to articulate it in the way that it's in my mind, but I think, you know, there's this larger cultural question about where our safety lies. When this first came out, and I had just joined a committee, the advocacy coordinating team of the APA graduate student division, and offshoot, so that it wasn't a part of APA, we'd gotten together and we're having an online discussion, virtual discussion about how we were reacting as, you know, early career and in-school psychology trainees, how we were responding. And during that discussion, there was definitely, there were a couple of people that were part of the military that were really adamantly in support of national security, and that this question was, the ethics were second to national security. And so I got to think of this larger cultural question of, like, where does our safety lie? Does it lie in allowing ourselves to treat people however we deem necessary to make ourselves secure as a nation? Or does it lie in upholding the ethics that we have as a culture and how we treat people and how we enter the world in global negotiations? Like, are we ethical, moral people that are standing a value that we think is worthwhile, or are we people that are willing to hurt people with some idea that our safety lies in this one man in detention giving us some information about where a bomb might next come? Like, I don't mean to, but I just think that larger idea about, if we're making our arguments on these micro things of, like, how badly can we treat somebody, we're kind of ignoring as a world where we're putting our emphasis on where our true safety lies. So those are the thoughts that I had that could be points of discussion to start us off with, if anybody has a reaction to any of those or open to others.
Can I comment? Yeah. They're all great questions and all, but I'll only start with addressing your first one, because that was a question that was asked about, can you be safe and effective, be ethical and effective. And I agree with Dennis saying, yes, you can be both. But I think my point and what we found from the Hoffman report is that every provider, every psychologist, and I'm thinking outside interrogation, is just supposed to provide ethical care. And you should be ethical and be effective at what you do. But that's not the issue in here, is when we talk about it, it's the notion of the patient advocate, it's the notion of the safety monitor, is what happens, and that you need to have a system of checks and balances so that you are ethical interrogator. But what happens when something happens and goes over the top? The safety monitor, not in your role, is able to make sure that not what you're doing, but everybody else in the system is able. So why did Gitmo get to where it was? Because everybody, as you said, knows the Army manual, but there's some things that then happen. So that's why you need to separate the two, so that to ensure that there is a system of checks and balances, about that. So it's not that you can't be ethical and effective at the same time. Yeah, Laura?
So I wonder about this. So, okay, to backtrack a bit, I guess for a moment, my reading of the and I am no expert, but my reading of the report was that there were psychologists, at least one, not Lesso and not Mitchell, but the third psychologist named in the report itself, who there was a complaint.
James.
Thank you, yes.
Larry James.
The complaint against him that he had sort of misrepresented himself to the detainee, and that he was part of the BSCT. And the question was he the chair of the BSCT, or was he just a member, or what was exactly his role? And then sort of got caught up in technicalities in the allegation. But and then whatever the case was in terms of his role, should he have been part of the biscuit at all? I think is the question. One of the questions raised by the report and raised by these conversations. And I mean, Dennis, your point is wonderful that, had the psychologist you work with not been in a part close to that interrogation, that this detainee would have been even more psychologically harmed than he'd already been. But that's not always going to happen, right? That kind of psychologist is not always going to have that role, take that position. That team is not always going to be able to defer or choose to defer to that psychologist in their reading. And I know I see you wanting, but so my question is, if we are employed by the DoD as opposed to by even a hospital, and as Mary says, who is our client, are we able to, as humans, we are fallible, right? So sometimes we're going to make poor choices, and even if our our better angels are going to say to us, no, defer to the help of the detainee because that's my job here. Sometimes that's not going to happen, especially if it means, hey, am I going to lose my job if I do that? So I don't, so while it seems, I don't know if it's possible to be, if we can guarantee that psychologists will be able to be ethical and effective in all of these contexts. And I'm not sure what that means in terms of whether we should be there or not, but it makes me very nervous. I don't know what I would do if I were there. I would love to think that I, would have been a conscientious objector during Vietnam, and that I would have been a righteous Gentile during World War II, and that I would be an ethically, I would adhere to the ethics of my profession as a psychologist in detainee situations, but I don't know, because I'm a whip sometimes. So what position are we putting ourselves in when we sign up for these tasks?
Yeah.
I think I also, and I don't think that there's a clear solution here, but I guess I react to the emphasis on like intense policy change and checks and balances, because obviously there were oversights there and that's needed, but conversely, this is not a perfect parallel, but what comes up to me is thinking about organizations where there's been like an intensive suicide protocol implemented, and to cover the institution. I mean, there's of course, you don't want anyone to commit suicide, but the clear implication is you want to protect the system, not the patient. And when that system is forced upon you, the instances where that feels actually really contrary to good clinical judgment, and you're kind of forced to silence that clinical judgment in favor for this checks and balances kind of systemic piece. And this again, I feel like it's very easy to point to all the weaknesses and then not provide a solution, and that feels very much like what I'm doing. But I think that is a concern with how this is being navigated. We can implement these checks and balances. We can create these changes and reword things. But going back to kind of this cultural piece, who is that for and to what end?
Well, yeah. I mean, this kind of goes back to what I was saying about guild ethics versus professional ethics. I think you're absolutely right, Sarah. And there is such an enormously dysfunctional culture at the APA that goes far beyond the ethics committee. But the ethics committee, its emphasis on guild ethics, on we are protecting ourselves, we are protecting our relationship with DOD, etc. And however that is changed when the client is the psychologist, DOD, rather than the people with whom we are working, this is a tremendously troubling turn of events. And I think only when the APA ethics become professional ethics, which means do no harm, will I think about rejoining. I'll say something more about that in a moment. But let me say one other thing. We're spending a lot of time here talking about enhanced interrogation techniques. Actually, beyond about, I think it was, you may know more about this, Dennis, than I, 2006, this was less than of a concern. Actually, what constituted torture was a lot less of a concern. So we're talking about 0.00001% of whatever has gone on in these detainee systems, whether they're in Guantanamo or the black sites or whatever. It was the climate that was established there. The International Committee on the Red Cross said that it was the climate that was tantamount to torture. The ways in which people were handled. And these, and this is again a very troubling role because it was the psychologists, actually part of the Biscuit team, but responding sort of in generally, determined this system of punishments and rewards for how detainees should be treated. One piece of toilet paper or none, which for an Arab man is, well, these are such humiliating things. Can you have your Quran or not? Do you get a blanket on your bed or not? And of course, so much about solitary and how much you can be in solitary. It was this climate that was torturous, that constituted torture. It was not the enhanced interrogation technique. So we sort of talk about these very, obviously they had constituted it earlier, but we need to be aware that we're talking about something so much more subtle than I think our minds keep going to.
But maybe it's less subtle, because what you're saying is the climate is one of hatred, contempt, dehumanization. That's not subtle.
Absolutely.
And I think we fail to recognize that. We're saying, oh, we're just defending ourselves. When actually what we're doing is
we're breaking
our hatred. We're saying that's not a human being.
We're inculcating learned helplessness is what we're doing.
No, but also I think you're sure about, this is by dehumanizing who the detainees is, that's another level that, gets reinforced by all of this. But, so I agree with the notion about the climate. But I think what I want to add to what's been said is there is a movement afoot to to change that resolution that was passed. You know, and the issue, and there is a movement afoot to redefine waterboarding, which had at one point been not considered torture, and then got defined as torture, and now there's a movement afoot to say it's not. You know, so I think it gets into some of these concerns about, you know, it's not so clear, it's a slippery slope, you know, on some of these things, and, you know, so what do we do about it?
Yeah.
But I just want to add your comment, is you're saying you don't feel educated enough. I think just the notion of call for comment is, don't worry about that. I would just put in your comments, you know, because all these comments will get vetted, and they will be integrated and so on. And some of it is you hope to have the trust that there are good people, you know, doing that. But that's why, again, the checks and balances to make sure that the comment that's unpopular is not get thrown out the window.
Well, I think your response is exactly kind of speaking to my fear, is that as an uneducated consumer of this language, and in the climate of the APA as it has been up until now, and who knows going forward, I don't trust necessarily the checks and balances in place. I'm not sure that where my comment goes, that I'm not going to be endorsing something that doesn't actually represent my values, because understanding the language as a whole, like, my understanding is not there. And that's the piece that I think a lot of us, you know, at this point in our relationship with APA are really struggling with, is this, you know, especially for us that are psychologists in training at this time, where the APA is holding such sway over all the decisions that we make, because it's what school do we apply to, what internship do we get into, what's the beginning of our career going to like to. So we owe APA so much at this point and are so dependent upon it. Yet there's this information that this organization is corrupt in a way that,
well, I don't want to be here defending APA against you know, the others. You know, so I want to avoid using terms like APA is corrupt.
Fair enough.
So the thing is that, yes, there are things that in APA that absolutely need change, you know, and that some people don't join organizations, you know, which I respect, you know, it's a prerogative, and some will protest, and which is certainly the prerogative. But I don't want to demonize all of APA in that. But I think to think about the kinds of things that your voice can be heard. And I think the consciousness that was raised, and until I see otherwise, you know, by the Hoffman report, that there are individuals, Steve Reisner, who would have been here, is on APA Council. And what other voice can you say would support what we're talking about than his voice? You know, who would make sure that whatever voice you have, you know, that may not be with, you know, whatever, whether it's majority, minority, would try to squash, would make sure that it doesn't get squashed. So I'm saying we need to look at that.
Except he's one
Right,
in
but he's also the
160.
guy that didn't show up.
Exactly. Could I just say something about, you know, obviously we appreciate the right to protest or to join, but when Steve Reisner gave a very impassioned speech last week about why one should join, there are a lot of people still members of the APA, and let me tell you how I responded. Some of you may remember there was a wonderful family therapist called Carl Whitaker. Anybody who studies family systems probably has read about Carl Whitaker's work. He was an amazing man, and he used to say, when I enter a family, when I go to work in a family, which is always a dysfunctional system, I go with a partner. I go over the wall, and I hold my hand over the wall, and my partner stays outside of the system and holds my hand. And when I start getting co-opted into that system, my partner gives me a yank. Now, I don't want to be grandiose, but I think that, you know, there are many of us who have remained on the outside, and we will give a yank. I'm delighted, surprised that Stephen Saul's joined again. I know why Reisner did, and I think it's terrific. I think Jean Maria has Dan Albus, who wrote the referendum, somebody I never believed in a million years would rejoin the APA. Lots of people are joining it. That's terrific. But we will stay outside and hold our hands over the wall, and we will say, hey guys, you're being co-opted, if we think that's happening. And if we don't, then eventually we may join.
And I think some of the, when you were talking about the kind of the larger cultural question, when I think about the Hoffman report and reactions to it, as well as the policies themselves that were being addressed, there's a lot of vagueness in all of them. And I think what's going on in a lot of ways is we're projecting onto it. And I think what we're projecting is a lot of our anxieties and fears about the post 9/11 world and living in what is becoming an increasing security state, and our frustrations with the two wars. And I think in a lot of ways, kind of how we're reacting to this speaks to our own opinions on these things. And I think like there's a lot of outrage within the psychology community, and I think a lot of that comes from the fact that the psychology community is probably, you know, a more globalist and liberal population than the United States military. And when you were saying that there's a lot of people who are national security, I think what we're seeing is that debate kind of moving into our spectrum. And I think that's something we need to really be aware of, and I think it's questions that we need to ask, because, you know, there's a lot of dysfunction going on in this country, and I think the arguments over this is a reflection of that. And, you know, it might be kind of reflected in the blue state, red state paradigm, and these things that are passing for political debates this year. And, you know, where we don't know what's going on. We don't know what's going on in the future. And it's these two very diametrically opposed worldviews that are kind of seeping into our career. And I think because the military, it's tricky to be a military psychologist. And I'm not even saying supporting interrogations in general. I cannot think of a job in the military that is more frequently at odds with commanders than anything involving a psychologist, whether it's in a mental health situation or in an interrogation situation, you know, where you're looking out for detainees. And I know a lot of, you know, mental health gets a lot of pushback from commanders, because a lot of the things that are in the best interest of a clinician's patients is directly gets in the way of a commander's mission. And that's the really tough part about anything involving the Department of Defense, is that you have to remember the Department of Defense has a mission, and every unit within it has a mission, and that mission is to basically be the blunt instrument of foreign policy for the United States government. And what it does is distasteful, to say the least. You know, there's, you know, we're basically being sent to, you know, other countries to conduct war, which, you know, goes very much against a lot of what we do, and has consequences for what we do, in that, you know, we have soldiers coming back from multiple deployments, and they aren't really being taken care of because the command climates, you know, go against that. And that kind of ties into what you were talking about with the psyche of the interrogators. You know, that's one of the reasons I got out of the business, was I saw kind of what the 20-year guys were looking like and how they were acting, and it wasn't where I wanted to be. And this is a much better karma job than being an interrogator. And so I think whether the APA does it or a better organization comes along and does it, we need to support our military psychologists whose ethical interests run contrary to organizational interests of the military. And I think that goes into Now, I don't know if is it Division 39, that's public service?
Psychoanalysis.
No, that's psychoanalysis. I know there's one of the other ones there's a psychologist in the public service that does like VA, and then there's, Division 19 that's military psychologist.
Right.
And I think, it's very important that these psychologists have an outlet that isn't necessarily within their lane to be able to say, this is what I'm running into, and for them to provide guidance. Because if, like, kind of to what Laura was saying, is I don't know how, you don't know how you're going to handle it because you're going to be saying these very unpopular opinions. Like, fortunately, the psychologist in question that said, you're not talking to this guy anymore, it's funny because he was not the highest ranking person there, so, by all rights, we had majors, he was a captain, there were majors and lieutenant colonels that could very well have said, well, that's very nice, Captain, but here's what we're going to do. But he had the force of character to kind of stand up and do what he needed to do, and then one of the other psychologists was a full-bird colonel who could basically tell everybody in our task force to go pound sand. But they were lucky that they felt that they were comfortable enough in their own professional opinion that they could stand up to that. And that isn't something that everybody can do. That isn't necessarily, that's not something that there's a lot of military psychologists who will bow to command pressure. And that's how we usually end up having problems down the road. A lot of these, whether it's Fort Carson where you had all the murders, there were a lot of warning signs thrown up by mental health that commander said, that's very nice, doctor, but. And I think we need to have an external support organization for particularly military psychologists to help them.
Yeah, I just want to say, maybe it's my own kind of ignorance or discomfort or whatever, but I see this as a large cultural problem. I understand that the military and psychology, certain aspects of psychology, maybe clinical psychology, are gonna not always mesh with one another. But I think this problem of ethics is larger than the problems of the military. Although I take your point, Dennis, I think everybody's paranoid not only since 9/11, but since we have a global economy and all kinds of things like that. But in terms of the ethics of psychologists, I think the issue is, there are many issues, but one of them is who are you working for? And that's, I think, what the Hoffman report brings out. And it doesn't happen just with the military. It happens with me and with the students that I supervise. I've been going through something for the last 3 weeks with somebody who's working with a child and then got all involved in these mandates to report, which became treatment disruptive. And so that, and again, it was part of that was the clinic's got to cover its ass. And they weren't really paying attention because they couldn't afford to the ramifications of that it was having on the patient or the patient's family, right? So we're involved in these kinds of situations all the time. And I think the military, this is, this kind of example really kind of shouts out at us, but we're involved in these kinds of things all the time. When we're working with children, are we really working with the parents, or are we working for the child? If we're working with a couple, or we're working with family systems, I had somebody once say to me, to whom is your fiduciary responsibility? Now I have to look that up, I didn't even know what that meant. But he was saying, you're seeing my child, but you're working for me, and he wasn't even paying. Right? But these are questions that we have all of the time that I think we have to answer. And when we're in bureaucratic organizations rather than democratic organizations, these questions don't even come up. And I think that's the problem that I have with APA. It's not that I'm anti-organizational, although I think I am anti-bureaucracy. I've had, been involved in I put my body on the line many, many times in the 60s and the 70s. That's different from belonging to a bureaucracy. So it's not that I'm not politically active. It's that the ways that I choose to be politically active may not be on that side of the wall, maybe on the other side.
Yeah.
But I think these are larger questions we have to ask ourselves that the Hoffman report brings up.
I just want to, I'm going to call in 1 second. I just want to say, piggybacking on what you just said about the bureaucracy versus, I want to apologize. When I said corrupt APA, I actually don't know about the organization as a whole. But what I specifically was referring to is Beneke and his conflict between keeping this relationship with the DoD, which I understand, a part of me understands that there's a greater good there too when you're thinking about jobs for psychologists, but also that the job as the ethics director is to debate the ethics, and that wasn't what was happening. So that I saw as a corruption of it, or a conflict of interest. So I was specifically really referring to that when you're in this bigger organization, how if we're not upholding this meta kind of view of ethics, and that's what we're ultimately responsible for, this kind of thing gets sidetracked very easily in a way that's detrimental to the organization as a whole. Period.
Yeah, a couple things. So I'm a computer scientist. I'm familiar with codes of ethics for some of our professional organizations, and the relationship that an engineer would have to his employer is second to the safety of the public. And so in some respects, it has a similar pattern. But one of the things that I know that these organizations do is protect the whistleblowers who, and I'm wondering if that's something that's possible within the context of the APA, and what reasons for or against something like that would be.
I can certainly talk to, not nearly as well as she can, Maria Arrigo's experience. Jean Marie is one of the people who's joined Stephen and Stephen in rejoining the APA. And she blew the whistle on Penn's task force. She saw clearly what was going on. And she was castigated. At one point, Akucha basically went public and said Jean Maria was the child of a daughter of somebody who'd been in the military. And I believe he was a military interrogator. And I don't remember what Kucha said, but it was either he killed himself or, I mean, something that was completely fictional, and that therefore she was prejudiced against the outcome of this committee. That was the kind of underhanded, it was hardly underhanded, it was broadcast in large letters, but that was the kind of treatment that whistleblowers got. Stephen Saltz and Reisner and to a much lesser extent, I all got castigated by different people. It continues even to this day on the, some list says, if there is a way of protecting, and I think there will be now, I think that these are part of the changes that people are quite sensitive to allow people to speak critically of the APA. I think your question is a very good one about what happens when you put information even online about what you'd like to see with the evidence. Do you get treated respectfully? Do you get dismissed? I mean, that's not quite the same as whistleblowing, but again, it's that treatment of the outside versus the inside.
Yeah. And that's, I think what you're describing is whistleblowing against the organization that is the professional organization. In the case, what I'm describing is whistleblowing against your employer, which where the professional organization would come to your aid to support a claim of.
That's how the Penn's report initially was started. It was the military psychologists who wanted to know, will APA come to your aid? And without getting into all the issues, there wasn't a good answer at the time, and you could see all the stuff that happened. But I think you raised a good question about the whistleblower role. Is that I don't know that APA has a policy specifically about whistleblowing and stuff like that. I think it's a good suggestion, but I think that what I'd like to respond to is the issue about the diversity of views and perspectives on all sides. I understand what you're saying, but if you know what happened on all those listservs. It was very combative across different perspectives, and that's why this notion of civility, how do you people were attacked on all sides. So how do you have, a civil discussion, and how do you address all these things in a way without saying, as you said, you've been criticized, but many people have been criticized on all sides of the equation. How do you get somewhere, without that, personal ad hominem kinds of attacks? And I think that's the culture that we need to develop if we're talking about moving any of this stuff, along. And when you ask about the question of putting in your comments, I would be surprised, and now as you know, I'm APA, these guys are not, is that I would say that there would be no repercussion, because I think you could post them anonymously, and there should be no repercussion, to you as an individual. So that, and I would say that there are the kind of individuals from the outside and from the inside who will say, let's look to see what the merit is. Because when these comments are reviewed, there is a body that looks at to make sure, and it's vetted. That's why it takes so long. That's why in the past, policy takes 3 years for one little thing to go through. Because everybody has to look at it to make sure, did we leave anything out and stuff. So that's why I really encourage, you say your voice, and if you get misrepresented or if it gets left out, there are people who say, what happens? I put this in and it's not there now. So you need those, voices to be there.
It's less me worrying about repercussions of making my voice known as it is about me understanding what I'm endorsing.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I feel like,
If you don't understand it, there's something wrong with you.
well,
You're a smart woman. You're in a PhD
Right.
program. If the language is such that you can't understand, then you have to already start
Well,
asking.
no,
this is actually,
I would say yes and no to that, because I think that's where you look at some of the leadership at the time in 2005. These are all smart people on all sides, and there were some specifics, like in the Army manual and stuff. Some of the people didn't know the ramifications of those things, those words, and that's where not being advised, not being told, and that's where the openness, the transparency of this stuff needs to happen, to make sure that if you don't understand, that somebody is not holding back information about it so that you can understand.
I feel like simple words.
Yeah.
That I think, please, Sarah.
Yeah.
No, because.
Well, what occurs to me is if you don't understand a system where someone needs to explain it to you is a dangerous one in my mind. Because there's room for interpretation, there's room for misrepresentation. What was striking to me, Des, when you were talking about how clearly stated the manual that you had was, the thought I had so strikingly was, wow, so the military had such a clearer sense of what was and wasn't okay than we as psychologists did. I mean, that was really striking to me. And to have such vague terms and to need someone to translate, that feels really unsafe to me.
But you see, the military is different from psychology. Just like when you practice psychology, I don't know how clear some things are when I practice therapy.
Sure, I appreciate the ambiguity, but
you know.
if this is a set of guidelines being given to kind of...
And they do need to be clear, that
Right,
I
that-
agree.
yeah.
I agree.
I mean, and having been practiced both interrogation and psychotherapy, no manual can properly prepare you for it. Like that is an impossible task.
That's what
But I will say that there was never any issue of there was never any gray area about what I was and was not allowed to do. And when, and anytime that something came up, we addressed it. There was one non-military organization that worked with us that their policy was to do 2 people interrogations. And because they were operating in our facility, they were subject to our rules. And one of the questions that that I raised was, how do we make sure this does not become a Mutt and Jeff approach, which is good cop, bad cop? And that was one of the things that on every interrogation plan and every time we went in was, do not do, because good cop, bad cop is actually one of the restricted interrogation techniques that requires, because the problem is that usually when you don't respond to bad cop, or when the paradigm doesn't work, bad cop becomes worse cop, and then it's a slippery slope into crossing the line. So you want to make sure it's rehearsed and you're clearly, so we just say no. And that was one of the things, and that was one of the things as a senior interrogator I had to watch out for. So we knew what was right and what was wrong. And even though implementing, a love of family approach, that none of them look the same. You can't teach the approach technique itself any more than you can teach the very vague general principles of psychotherapy. But you can still know what right is and what your limits are. And I think that's my concern is that the interrogation manual was very clear about what torture is, but I was trained on the interrogation manual, are necessarily our psychologists. And then it goes into the other, ethical places too, is, are there other places where those ethics aren't as clearly delineated? And I think that's something that needs to be addressed. And it needs to be trained and it needs to be overseen. Like every quarter, we were required to do training on the 17, these are the approved approach techniques, which are the ones that, what approval do you need to do this? What approval do you need to do that? And it was very important that we did that, because that way, it, again, reduced the ambiguity, because there was constant quarterly training. And we took it seriously. And I know there are places that don't, but that's not a systemic problem necessarily as much as it's a problem with people that are not taking it seriously.
Yeah, but it still raises the question of whether military ethics, as clear as they might be, are overlap, oppose, or contradict, or whatever, the ethics of psychologists. And I think we keep just slipping right past that. That maybe we don't know what our ethical obligations are. Maybe we don't want to talk about that. Or maybe we especially don't want to talk about it if it seems like it's going to come against someone who's employing us. And I still think that's what needs to be done. I'm not looking for an answer, guys. I know that this is complicated, but I can just hear us just slipping right out from under it. And
well, I appreciate the point, especially about how hard it is to talk to your employer, because that's it's a hierarchy and it's a power difference. And this is a culture that I have become used to thinking of as a very individualistic culture, a culture that's, independent, and I'm from a culture that's collectivistic and more sort of hierarchically oriented. So for me, it's both, the Hoffman report is both surprising and not, and also familiar, because this kinds of, lack of accountability or sort of obfuscating justice or not investigating things that are kind of screaming at you is familiar to a post-Soviet space, But it's very unfamiliar for me when I see it in a country that my country takes ideals from, ideals of democracy and so on and so on. And your point about how difficult it is to be somebody who is in a minority and to have to talk to your superiors, whether it's military or whether it's psychology, your supervisors, especially when you are on the side that you don't have a lot of people next to you, right, when you're a whistleblower. That's, I think, what makes it so difficult to act in an ethical way sometimes. I mean, I know I'm making an obvious point, but I'm a little bit overwhelmed by having to be a psychologist and then knowing that ethical guidelines can change because somebody in power decides that this is no longer going to be a guideline, or someone decides that this is no longer going to be a law. So I may want to follow things, but you know, it's kind of like losing your ground.
So, thinking about the military, sorry, I'm getting some more stuff out in a second. The military versus sort of organizational psychology or individual psychologists. Karen, I think you make a good point that we are not the military. They have clearly defined ethical, legal, operational, you know, SOPs. Like they have SOPs. We don't have those, right? We shouldn't, I don't think. Standard operating procedures. But do no harm, to me, is clear. Period, end of story. So Dennis, when you talk about, like, we had, you know, in the military there's the soldiers code, the this and the that and that. Do we need more than do no harm? And I think it seems like, okay, sometimes we do when, okay, so how much harm, or what is harm? Is sleep deprivation harm if it's not, like, you know, bodily harm or psychological harm that lasts beyond a certain length of time? Maybe this is just purely idealism, but that to me is black and white. And I don't know why, I mean, I do know why we need more than that, but when it gets more than that, like that's who we are. To be a psychologist, that's who we are, plus the work we do in our different theoretical positions and so forth. But to work with the military, like, do no harm unless it's going to prevent, you know, okay, so we're doing interrogations, and so if we're harming this one individual maybe a little bit for the sake of not harming thousands of people who are going to be the subject of the next terrorist attack, what are the cost-benefit analysis? But I don't know, I think that unless we hold true to the that one-liner, like, that's it.
Well, I think that you're bringing up a really good point too, because I also want to think about, like, we've talked a lot about psychologists and their relationship to their jobs in the military or working in this situation, but we also are an organization of people that are there to help a lot of other people that aren't involved with this at all. And how can we tout that we're there to do no harm, and that the anxiety and discomfort that we put our patients through in hope that we're going to help them overcome something? Like, how do we hold that as an ideal and something that we should do, and it not get confused with this other thing? Like, it makes it, you know, it's so difficult already as psychologists to get the trust of our patients and of the culture at large, that what we have to offer as mental health professionals is not only useful but viable and not dangerous. And I think that this one of the things that hasn't gotten touched on today is how damning this situation is, and this relationship with the military is, for what we want to do as a profession in a much larger scheme. That where are our priorities? National security or national mental health? Like, it's a very,
Or individual mental health.
To what
well,
extent?
individuals in the nation is what I meant by
But those are
national.
different. I think those are different.
To what extent have we as psychologists been damaged by this report and by the amount of publicity that this has brought? And I think it's a very big question. I've certainly heard people who've heard it from their patients. Sometimes it's been very productive. Sometimes people have walked out. No, they probably were already at the door. But it's certainly, you know, and maybe we should. I mean, if you get into a treatment relationship, it doesn't immediately confer authority and trust onto you. Patients will always test it.
One who's just not even walking through the door because of this.
Well, that's
Right.
the very good question. That's exactly it.
Oh, that's me. I'm sorry. I thought I turned it off.
It's so nice.
Yeah,
We could do it for little Bob.
There we go.
One thing that's probably not quite related to what we just said, but it's been shown, how research has shown, that enhanced interrogation doesn't work anyway.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
All the more reason to say, great, then do no
Also,
harm.
yeah,
Period,
you-
end of
you-
story.
you-
Like,
right.
don't even try. It's not worth it.
And I think like that's when there is a military ethics, like, there's field manual for that too. Like you said, everything's written down. But at the very start of it, like that's not what they begin you. They don't give you the ethical manual and say learn this. They do it through our creeds. And I think that's something that the APA might, if they are serious about it, then what they need to do is focus on first, do no harm. Like that is important. And that should be the focus of our ethics, not a 75, 85 page code written by lawyers, because that just says we are more concerned about the ethics of the thing than the spirit of it, the letter of the law as opposed to the spirit of the law. And I think by having something like, even if it is just the one-liner of first do no harm, that's a start. And you know, even if it's something like the psychologist's oath, which is a paragraph, you know, something like that says here is the general guideline, and everything else that we do is derived from that one thing. Then I think we're going to be in good shape. But I think as long as lawyers are involved, that's going to be a problem, because again, you know, that's not necessarily their interest. It's the guild, you know, the guild ethics / you know, CYA kind of thing, as opposed to, no, this is here is where our moral compass is set, not here are the prescribed circumstances under which we will act in certain ways and in certain things, and you insert into the matrix and it tells you how to behave.
So I'm not actually that optimistic, because lawyers are always going to be involved.
I didn't say I thought it was going to change.
But you know, to the point where that one word, effective, suddenly had some ambiguity in it, and that the other three words are still pretty simple and probably would have been, everyone would have accepted and understood what the four of them all meant together. Is kind of basic. I mean, it was basic and simple, but there was a political need to interpret the code in a way that was at odds with the original intent. And I think this speaks to what your concerns are, is that how are you going to avoid a weak statement of ethics? And my claim is that you can't if there's somebody who needs them to be different in some way.
Right, and that really gets to the issue of intent, is that if they intend to, it's really difficult to avoid all that, you know, and so that's where you need to have some way of checks and balances and make sure that, well, if someone has the intent, that it gets identified, you know, and it gets, you know, culled out. Because, yeah, if somebody really wants to sabotage or take away, you know, what you've done, I wouldn't be very optimistic either.
But who would have thought that the word effective?
I know.
Was,
well, I know. Who would have thought? Because that's where many people, you know, thought, oh, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But it was the misinterpretation of that leads to the problem. If people say, oh, this is a loophole, we can get by this.
Effective is one of those words, though, again, I mean, we can be asking this of anything, I think, but effective for whom? Effective for what purpose?
Well,
Right.
what was written in the pens was that it was effective interrogation. So that, you know, but it's, so it was
Yeah,
the
but still.
interrogator that making the interrogation effective. So,
To get
but
information.
to get the information.
But to your point, Karen, like, who are our clients?
Yeah, but yeah, so it addresses who are our clients and addresses this whole thing. If your intent is to look for the loophole, they'll find it, you know.
I have a reaction to all of this. I mean, it feels fitting as psychologists that we're very hung up on language. That's kind of
The lawyers are.
But I think on our end also, I mean, that's kind of the frame through which we view and understand and work with the world. And I think that in therapy, I always come up against kind of the limits of language and what's kind of beyond the scope of language. And it's a reaction I'm feeling in here of there's the language, and it's very important, certainly, and needs to be kind of expressed and worked with in this essential way. But what's kind of the part beyond the words?
Well, that's where the issue of the climate, the intent, and all of that and the spirit are far more important than the language. That's why I would agree with you on that part about bureaucracy, that, you know, all of that stuff means nothing if your intent and, you know, all of that isn't, you know, aligned with, you know, the moral, ethical, you know, stance.
So we just have about 10 minutes left, and in this, you know, in these last minutes, I just was wondering if we can focus any of our comments towards looking forward. Like we've sussed out a lot of what the problem is and how we got here, but does anybody have thoughts about forward thinking?
I'm allowed now too. I would love to ask especially the faculty, teachers, professionals on the panel for your opinion as a trainee clinician who is looking towards internship, you know, applications in the coming year and beyond all of that. Like, what do we do? As Mary said, the APA has an impact potentially on our professional lives. If we choose to prioritize an APA accredited internship, does that potentially condone a system that we don't that perhaps, as I'm just speaking as an individual, perhaps I don't want to be a part of? How to go beyond withholding the dues or not? It's such a part of our professional structure as trainee clinicians, and I don't know how to navigate that, and I would love for your opinions.
Well, I certainly wouldn't advocate boycotting an APA accredited setting, because that you must have that if you possibly can for your career, and that's an incredible dilemma you just put out there, a moral dilemma in some ways for me, fortunately, long past when I have to consider it. But and you know, obviously some of us have questions about APA's accreditation of academic institutions, because you and I were talking about this earlier, because they're so opposed to psychodynamic programs right now. But they're the game in town, and here I'm being cynical. But I'm thinking about your careers coming up. If you withhold your dues, I think then it's really important to also be focused on what is happening in the APA and know people who are there and be able to raise your voice, as I do, when you need to, until perhaps this incredibly unwieldy ship has been steered into a better course. I don't know when that's going to be, but at the same time, I think you have to protect yourself professionally.
Yeah, you raised many questions that go much further than that. You know, I think the pragmatic side, as saying, is that is the system that is in place right now, and is that where you want to choose to protest? You know, at the same time, there are many things wrong with the current accreditation system. It has nothing to do with the Hoffman report. You know, it doesn't allow for not only, you know, international, you know, kinds of internships, because we don't have the accreditation standards that crosswalk between cross-national boundaries. You know, and there are some great experiences that you can get, but they're just not APA accredited. You know, so you raise far more bigger questions, you know, in that. I think the other thing I would say is in terms of APA, because I don't think this form was intended as being for APA or not for APA, but is that where do you make a difference? Where can you make a difference? You know, and the thing is that if you're I got into administration and greatly in part because that was where I could make a difference. You know, instead of being an individual staff person, you know, at a clinic and so on, you know, because I was protesting certain things, I ended up being the director of the clinic, you know, and I said, oh, okay, I can make the changes that I thought were, you know, were possible. So by participating, and if you're not, you know, that doesn't mean that your strategies aren't also, you know, but I think it's an opportunity to do some of that. But there's a lot bigger questions in what you say, and I think there's the short term and then the long term.
I mean, I'm not one of the faculty, but I'm in a situation that's very similar with the VA, because I am both a veteran enrolled in VA healthcare and a practitioner at a VA hospital. And the VA is part of the reason why I went into clinical psychology, because I saw a lot of my friends and brothers and sisters getting substandard quality healthcare, and in my arrogance, I thought I could do better. But that's the thing. It's, you know, the VA, everything you hear about it is true. All of the bad things are true, but all of the good things are true too.
That's true.
And I'm sure. And so it's one of those things that I know that I'm not necessarily going to be able to fix the VA because it is, you know, the largest managed healthcare system in the country, and it's very hard for one clinician to do that. But I know I have already made a difference for several of the veterans that I work with, and that's why I'm doing this. And so I stick with it. And I think that's and the VA needs to change from within, and it also needs pressure on it from without. And I think the APA is no different. And I think that we need students to be saying, we are the future of this organization, we're going to take control of it into the direction that it's going. We need experienced people saying, the way we've been doing things isn't right, we need to change it. But then also to say, here's some things that have worked and here's why. But then we also need people from without, like Dr. Palenche and Dr. Lombardi, to say, no, like this is why I do not want to be part of you, and in no, unclear terms to say what's wrong with you. And so I think it's going to take a bit of everything to change it, and it's a really big village.
Yeah. Laura, did I hear you say you feel controlled by the APA, or you're worried about how much it could control you?
I didn't say it. It's interesting that that's what you heard. No, I mean that they're not that I feel like the active hand of like that I feel actively controlled, but that they're, as trainees, we exist in a system where the APA can define our career or not. Maybe not necessarily.
Yeah.
So there is a control there, right?
Yeah, I mean, because I think that that's complicated. I mean, as Jean pointed out, there are wonderful internships that are not APA accredited. If you need an APA, if you want to work for the VA,
Right.
and secondarily, because this is not always true, but this is what people tell you, if you want to teach in a university, it's good to have, with the VA, you have to have an APA internship. With university jobs, it's good to have an APA internship. Outside of that, it doesn't control your career. But I think that there are all kinds of ways in which, as Jean was pointing out, the ways in which they accredit schools, the kinds of demands that they make in terms of training, that they do have some control over. And, if you feel like you can get in there and be a voice and start to change things, do it. If you're just going to feel controlled by them, why bother?
Any closing comments? Well, on the behalf of the Donor Advocacy Committee, thank you everyone for coming, and our panelists for giving up your Sunday to come and share your thoughts with us. I am very moved and feel very informed as a result of today, and I hope that more people will take the opportunity to watch the video and find out some of the things that we found out and be inspired by the discussion as much as I have been. And with that, we'll be at a close. Thank you so much.